Okay, welcome. Good to see you, Amanda.
Good to see you, Karen. Thanks for having me. It's great to
Great,
see you. I wish I could see you
absolutely.
in person.
I know. So welcome, everybody. This is Karen DuBois-Walton coming to you from Storytellers New Haven. Still in our virtual world as we are into the summer months, July 20th to be exact, 2020. We are continuing our connection through Storytellers New Haven in this virtual mode for the time being. As most of you know, Storytellers has been around for the past 3 years, founded by Kevin and I, really with the idea of building community, using story as a way to do that. We see story as a way to connect across perceived differences. As we hear each other's stories, we have an opportunity to connect to the humanity in each of us. We see things, hear things that we say, oh, yeah, I relate to that. We hear things that are like, oh, that's interesting. I never would have thought of that. And in all of that, sort of just build bridges across many types of differences. So to do this conversation in the middle of summer 2020, which has been such an incredible summer, right? We've been on lockdown because of COVID. We have seen some of the most amazing, sustained and inclusive sorts of uprisings and demonstrations around racial awakening, racial equity, exploring racial disparities, and really bringing things to light. And so while we usually take a break over the summer, we thought we would do some quick conversations with people about what this has all meant in their lives. And, you know, as Storytellers was a place that started to do this well before summer 2020, we know there are a lot of places, a lot of corners where people were starting to have conversations, were really starting to center racial equity in their work. And so I'm really thrilled to be able to have this time to talk with Amanda Skinner, who is the president of Planned Parenthood of Southern New England and PP Votes CT and PP Votes Rhode Island and all of the associated Planned Parenthood entities in this neck of the woods. And somebody who in her leadership role there has really centered equity, racial equity in the work there. And it's a particular pleasure for me to invite you to do this little mini conversation with me because the idea of it very much came from Amanda. And it was something that you posted on Facebook. I'm probably on social media far too much, but I noticed something you posted that talked about the Share the Mic movement. And it caused me to jump over to Instagram and see what Share the Mic was all about. And it was this opportunity where particularly it seemed like women who had a strong following, and white women who had a strong following on social media, turned their social media over to center the voice of somebody who may not have had following in that same sort of audience. Typically a woman of color. I've seen it evolve into men having Share the Mic and all sorts of things. So it sort of prompted me to think, geez, I'd love to have some of this in the midst of all that's going on in the world, inspired by the Share the Mic, sort of a few of these little brief conversations. So long introduction to Amanda Skinner, who's with us today. And I really appreciate that she jumped at the opportunity to do this with me. So welcome, Amanda.
Hi, Karen. Thank you so much. I said this already, but I'm so happy to see you and so happy to have a conversation with you. And just to parenthetically want to say, if people aren't following Share the Mic on Instagram, I want to encourage them to do it. I have found so many amazing, cool people to follow and learn from through the Share the Mic effort. And it's like totally exploded and taken on a whole new life. And so just want to throw that out there for folks.
Absolutely. You know, I use Facebook much more than I use Instagram. So I didn't have a whole ton of people that I was following on Instagram. Since Share the Mic, I think the people I'm following has probably doubled or quadrupled because I, in the same way, have just found these amazing folks like, oh, I want to know more about this person and have been following. So yeah, so really cool thing. So I got to start with just, what did you think when so background, I tried to reach Amanda on phone and we missed each other a few times, and I sort of sent a cryptic text or email that said, I got this idea I want to run by you. And then we finally got on the phone and talked about it. So I'm so curious, what was your first thought when I broached this and said, hey, would you do this with me?
Well, my first thought was, yes, like totally, sign me up, put me in the game, coach. because, you know, if Karen DuBois-Walton asks me to do something, the answer is going to be yes, put me in the game. How high would you like me to jump? But then, you know, when I had a moment to, you know, sort of have a second reaction after yes, and a third reaction, the things that occurred to me in the moment were how flattered I was that you asked me, and honored and humbled that you asked me. And then, if I'm being totally honest, a little bit of anxiety about, like, what if I say something stupid or embarrassing? And then reminding myself that actually, you know, isn't that kind of the point?
Yeah.
That, you know, particularly as a white woman leader in an organization where we're trying to do justice, and particularly racial justice work, sometimes the most important thing for me to do is to be willing to have the conversation and to say the things, and to learn and to be humbled in a different way, and to be willing to sometimes risk saying the wrong thing to continue my own growth and learning so that I can be a better leader. So it was all of those things. Those were all the things. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. Great. I mean, so totally the spirit of what I want to create here is an opportunity to have a little glimpse into the kinds of conversations, because in this moment of heightened awareness and centering of racial equity, there is so much fear about jumping into the conversation around not wanting to offend, not wanting to say the wrong thing, not wanting to appear racist or not woke, and that is going to stifle us being able to get into the kinds of conversations that we have to have. And so, yes, so we want to have a space where, you know, it's okay to learn together, and to be able to call each other in, as opposed to what has become such a sort of cancel culture and call each other out kind of space. So certainly appreciate that. Yeah. So let's jump in. So I have, as an African-American woman, as a Black woman, I have felt like I thought about racial identity for the majority of my life. Before I had language to talk about development of racial identity stages or anything like that, it was just so much a part of my life, partly because I often grew up in places where white families were the majority, and we were usually a very small minority in communities. So that sense of difference was always there. I went into psychology, I think you know, and ended up studying a lot of things that touched on real theories of racial identity that were all centered around the development of racial identity amongst people who have some identity that's been marginalized in this community. So stages of developing Black identity and that kind of thing. So I'm really curious for people who walk through the world without a racially marginalized identity, this question of sort of, when did racial identity show up for you? Has it showed up for you, right? In what ways? When did that sort of beginning sense of whiteness, or, and I don't want to project, whatever you want to call your racial identity, right? Let me leave it open. Right? When did that evolve for you as a concept and take on some meaning?
So, you know, no surprise, I wasn't super conscious of my whiteness. I grew up in, I was more conscious that there was not whiteness than I was of my own whiteness in my childhood. So I grew up in a community that was fairly, or a town that was fairly racially diverse and ethnically diverse. My neighborhood, however, was not particularly racially or ethnically diverse. And so as I think about a question like this, one of the first things that comes to mind is, like, when was I first conscious of somebody being not what I was? Mm-hmm. And my best childhood friend, who I met when I was 3 years old, who lived down the street from me, his name is Salim. His name is still Salim Matthew. It was that then and still now. Salim is Indian, and I remember being aware that, like, we were really culturally different. He had art and statues in his house that I didn't have in my house. He was brown-skinned and I was not. So I remember being conscious of difference, but I don't remember being conscious that the difference was that I was white. I remember being conscious that the difference was that he was not.
Uh-huh.
And like when I think about what I was thinking as a kid, because most of my neighborhood looked like me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I became more conscious of ethnic identity. Grew up in an immigrant family, Italian immigrants, and so that Italian sort of immigrant ethos was very present in my life, but still not very conscious of being white, just to be clear. Like, it's really separating those, and so I had a cultural identity, but not really a real consciousness of being white and what that meant to me until adulthood. And I try to think about like the different times in my life where it maybe like glimmered up, because there were moments where it glimmered up. So it glimmered up when I was in college and I worked for the football team and the basketball team at my university, and a large percentage of the football and basketball players at my university were Black. And so I was more conscious of being white in spaces where I was a minority in the space that I was in. I went to baptism at a Black church in New Haven for a friend of mine's daughter, and remember being like really aware that I was like one of maybe, I don't know, 3 white women or white people in a room with hundreds of people. But a sense of racial identity, I would say not, to be totally honest, and this is one of those like things you don't really want to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, real consciousness of my whiteness and what my whiteness really means and the ways in which it has advantaged me. I would say that's been in the past 5 years. And I'm 49 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it hasn't had to be, like, I haven't had to think about that, right? Because I've been mostly in spaces where people looked mostly like me.
Mm-hmm. And so I got to know you through work at Planned Parenthood, where you were really leading in a space that had positioned itself intentionally to think about its work in intersectional way, to really think about issues of equity in the fullness, and have had an opportunity to see you lead in that space. And so to hear that it's something that you really feel like you came into a sort of fuller awareness of only 5 years ago. It's really powerful to see how in those 5 years, you know, and I being just a part of that time, you know, to see how you have translated that into work. You know, people have understood a term of white privilege, right? A term that was made popular, I think in the 80s, was written about in the 80s, but has become more popular recently to reflect the conscious and mostly unconscious advantages that whiteness gives to people, and in this society that is so white-centered, male-centered, hetero-centered, right? That there are privileges, there are advantages that go along with that. I'm interested in how that has shown up for you. As does that resonate with you? And what are those moments where your whiteness has been evidenced for you as something that was advantageous, or that was offering you some privilege?
Yeah, like, I don't know, all the time.
Yeah.
Now I'm aware of it. I'm like, oh, look, there it is again. It's showing up.
Yeah.
This is sort of a silly example, but it just happened recently where I was talking with one of my colleagues about people feeling like they have the ability to utilize their PTO at work. And she and I were talking about some staff not taking their vacation time that they have in their bank. And I said, I think this is one of those moments where my whiteness is playing into my struggle to understand why people have PTO and won't use it, because I don't sometimes use it because that's just how I roll. I don't feel like I need it. But it would never occur to me that I couldn't use it. And And my colleague was saying, like, yes, Amanda, yes, exactly. That is, your whiteness is actually part of how you think about people feeling like they genuinely have the agency to use their time off from work. So I know that may feel like such a small example, but it was such a, I'm using it because it's something that might not occur to other people as like it's in all the spaces is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
I was on a call the other day where it was like a Women in Leadership in Healthcare collaborative call. And we were talking, and I was the only person that represented an organization like Planned Parenthood. Everybody else was from like a hospital or health system. And everybody was talking about social determinants of health. And I found myself jumping into the conversation. Well, first of all, and there's so much here, but first of all, like basically it was like 20 people and there were maybe 2 women of color on the entire call. So first there's that, right? All these women leaders in healthcare, but almost all of them. And then second, I found myself thinking about the language of social determinants of health and how even that is language that enables us to be more comfortable with the thing. Because I've never thought of this before. I'm being totally obvious or honest that it's only been in the last week since I was on that I realized that language enables us to depersonalize the fact that actually these are systemically and structured determinants of people's ability to be healthy and well. And that is because of racism.
Yes.
They are not social determinants of health as if people have full and complete agency over all of these things. And that's not to take away people's individual like power and authority. I just mean like that there are structures and systems that are driving so much of this. And we need to start shifting the language around those things to be able to talk about racism so specifically there, because I think social determinants of health is language that allows us not to do that. And so in this call of almost all white women leaders, where I was very conscious of their whiteness and conscious of my whiteness and recognizing that as one of the white women on the call, I had the ability to say something more radical about this that might not have been received as well, or might have been received differently if it were the women of color on the call saying, actually, we need to change our language about this. And wow, we need to be more radical about, as healthcare organizations, how we show up in supporting policy initiatives that make change in our communities. This isn't all just about like creating some community health department in our hospital or in health system, and doing a couple nice things. Like we actually have a lot of power and we need to radically change how we're using it to support structural and systemic change. And that I could say that and possibly be heard and received in a different way, because I was just another one of the white women on the call. So I feel like one of the things that I've unpacked, particularly in the last 3 years, but even so in the couple of years before that, is that like there's almost not a moment in my life where my privilege as a white woman doesn't show up. And so the work is in part, at least part of it is in being conscious of that and like consciously conscious, intentionally conscious of that. And in each moment sort of dissecting it so that I can continue to bring that into my work as a leader at Planned Parenthood in an organization that's trying to do justice work.
Yeah. Such a beautiful example of right, the ability to recognize racism as baked into the systems and structures, and that there's no ground of non-racist or I don't see color, right? There's no space there where it's not at play, right? It's racist or it's anti-racist. Like we're either continuing these ideas and beliefs and systems and structures that have caused and promote and sustain the racial disparities that we see, or we're actively working against them, right? And we're in that realm of anti-racism. And I think, to me, I feel like thinking of it in that way frees some space to, opens up a space, because I think as soon as I've experienced it, as soon as racism gets introduced into conversation, people that are not as far along in their work can get very offended by that and shut down and triggered by that and go into the defensive space. I'm not racist. And I like the Ibram Kendi, how to be anti-racist sort of frame. I mean, opens it up that we all, like, I can be racist, right? When I buy into racist ideas and beliefs and things, as a person of color, right? And it is my work to continually be anti-racist and not make it like that's something that is a label that is stuck on somebody that determines their value and worth and is unchangeable. It's rather, I see it as something that is a function of being in this society, this world that's been created on this part of the planet for over 400 years, and that we all have an opportunity and a role to engage differently around it. You're working in healthcare. I do a lot of my work in housing, and housing and education are a couple of those places where the kinds of transformational changes that I want to see happen hit people so close to home, literally right to home, and are some of I perceive them to be some of the hardest places to help get people to actually give up some of what has been the privilege and the advantage in order to create greater opportunity. But even as I say that, and the sense of give up something, it's actually not the way I want to think about it as giving up something, because I think there's so much to gain if we could actually move into a space that valued people for their humanity, right? And if we turned neighborhoods that have been, like the ones I grew up in, that were so lacking in diversity, if we were able to actually create diversity in income, in race and ethnicity, and in all sorts of ways people show up, like the richness that we'll get in the community conversations, what happens in the supermarket, in the schools, and that kind of thing. And so even though I'm saying that, I want to shift for myself that sense of, having to give up that privilege, meaning that people are giving up something, as opposed to abandoning that white privilege or white advantage. What does that open us up for, right? What does it open white communities up for and white people up for?
Yeah, like it's a zero-sum game, right? It's not pie.
Right. Yes.
Right? So often, right?
I get a piece, right?
Right.
Piece is a lesson.
But I think one of the things you just said just really flagged something for me that I would love to share. As we think about creating these like diverse and rich communities, one of the things that I so love that you're doing these conversations is that one of the things we need to build is greater capacity for people to recognize and create relationship across difference. So I think it was like sort of baked in everything you said, but right, there's no space for I don't see color, because that means that you're taking away our ability to see the difference and celebrate it, recognize it, and then engage and create relationship across it.
Right.
And if we're going to create these much more diverse, vibrant communities, the people in those communities need the skills to be able to sort of fully leverage the power of that. Mm-hmm. And that's also some of what we're working on at PPSNE very intentionally right now, is how do we do that capacity building in individual people so that as we have more diverse teams, as we have a more diverse set of leaders in the organization, as we have a more diverse board, that they aren't just diverse, that they aren't even just inclusive, that they aren't even just equitable, that they are like powerful and effective and awesome. And that all the people that are making them up are like really fully capable of like just getting all the marrow out.
Yeah. So what, as you think about this journey for you having been really accelerated over the past 5 years, what was it? What were some of the things that sparked that for you and that helped you along the way in your journey?
You know, I think a thing that occurred, I think it was about 5 years ago. I might have the timing a little bit off. It might have been 6 years ago. I'm not sure. But I was on the, there was like a diversity, equity, and inclusion steering committee at a previous employer. I don't want to call them out, but it was a previous employer. People can look up my bio. And I remember the conversations that we were having in that room. And in particular, there were two Black men talking about their sons and their sons' encounters with police. And this was 5 or 6 years ago. Maybe even 7 years ago. I don't remember actually. It was like the personal storytelling was extraordinarily impactful for me. The conversations that we were having in that room, and at the moment, I don't think I really like totally got it, because we were in this like corporate DEI space, and I didn't really get how what was happening in that room was setting us up to be a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization, because I felt like we were in this funny place of privilege where we were just this group of leaders in the organization having these conversations. So it was deeply impactful for me, but at the moment, I didn't totally get how it was going to transform the organization.
Okay.
Which is funny because now I like totally get the method to the madness. With the benefit of retrospect and hindsight, and the benefit of what I actually had the privilege of participating in at PPSNE once I got to PPSNE with you, Karen. But I remember that being deeply impactful for me. There were other experiences throughout my life, really personal relationships, people that I dated, people I was friends with, people that were part of my family, who experienced the world differently because they were Black or brown, and were impacted by race. And that impacted me because I cared about them personally and I learned more. Certainly as a woman who identified as a feminist, and somebody who wanted to disrupt the patriarchy, I was able to see how patriarchy and racism were connected to each other. But it certainly, like, it all kind of really came together for me at Planned Parenthood, if I'm being honest. You know, it's a journey. Where I sort of most acutely saw the connections and intersectionality and impact of all of these things. And, you know, you said, if it's not racist, if it's not anti-racist, it's racist, and anybody can uphold racism. And I think one of the things that helped me, it shouldn't have to be this way, but I want to acknowledge that one of the things that helped me really learn that is when I reflect on my own life and think about the ways in which I have upheld like patriarchal systems as a woman. And I'm like, oh yeah, I really played into that, didn't I?
Right.
And so, you know, my career as a midwife, I haven't talked about that, but I'm a midwife. I was a midwife for 10 years in Waterbury, Connecticut. My patient population in Waterbury was often young women of color. And seeing the impact of racial injustice and the way they were treated in the healthcare delivery system, I became very impassioned about that. But again, like sort of the convergence of all of these separate pieces, they all converged for me when I came to Planned Parenthood. And a hugely impactful, you know, just transformative thing for me was working with co-creating effective and inclusive organizations, getting to know Neonu Span and Sonia Ahuja in particular, and working and partnering with them. The work that we did together as part of that work for PPSNE, really like learning some tools to be able to examine things through a different lens. That was when it really like coalesced.
Yeah.
And I had like all of these aha moments, and like you can't, once you learn it, you can't unlearn it. Once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it.
Yeah.
And I'm actually, one of the online forums that I'm part of now is this thing called the Unlearning Project, which I am continuing, because once you start to unlearn, you want to keep unlearning.
Unlearning.
Oh, like now I'm unpacking all this stuff. It's like going to race therapy, I think. And you want to just keep learning. Or I do anyway. Maybe some people want to run away, but for me, and I mean this in the most like not cop out, but really like hugely personally impactful way, it is transformative to talk about, to understand that racism is the water that we swim in.
Yeah.
And to come to that realization, for me, takes away the defensiveness and just opens me up to learning. And it doesn't mean I always get it right, and it doesn't mean I always see it, and it doesn't mean that I'm always doing the right thing. It doesn't make me a good person or a bad person, but it did liberate me in my ability to want to learn, because I didn't feel like I had to protect my identity as a nice person.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that. Absolutely. You know, you mentioned an intentional space that's been created at Planned Parenthood in order to do this work. And it just, you know, it makes me think about any of the things that we've had to learn or unlearn and learn something new, right? It's required us to have that space and those people, whether it's something from childhood or in adulthood, that makes it able for us to have the kinds of experiences and stumbles and get back up and try again experiences. And I hope that that's what we can lean into as a community, is, you know, not wanting to cancel and throw people away, but figuring out how do we do in these restorative ways, come back together and keep at it. I think about, as you were talking about people sharing their stories of their children at your previous employer and their interactions. I was on a call not too long ago with board members on another organization, and they were sharing right after the George Floyd horrific videos of his murder was surfaced. Predominantly white people sharing how impactful it had been for them to hear from people of color in their network about the talks that particularly Black families have with their children about growing up Black, about interacting with the police, and people being really struck by those kinds of conversations needing to be had. And my question to my fellow board members at that time was absolutely, I'm a mom of 2 African-American young men. My husband and I have absolutely had those kinds of conversations, and that's so meaningful. But my question also to my white colleagues was, I'm so curious about what are the conversations that are happening in white homes. I want to know what are white families imparting into their children to raise people that see the fullness of humanity, and connects to me because racial conversations were so much a part of my growing up, again, as somebody who grew up in a marginalized racial identity. So I can remember being little. My dad was in healthcare. He ran a large state psychiatric hospital in Western New York. And I can remember him as the director of this hospital coming home and at the kitchen table one night sharing a story where he sort of shook his head at my mom and he was like, I messed up today. Like, I really messed up today. And she was like, well, what happened? And I didn't entirely understand what he was saying at the moment. And she explained it to me later. But what had happened is he had said something that was a racial slur against Asians, and there were Asians in the room, and he used it in a sort of colloquial way. And as soon as it left his mouth, he knew like what he had said. And what he described in that moment was immediately apologizing to the folks that were in the room. And that at some level stayed with me, because fast forward, before going into housing, I worked in city government, and I had an experience not so different, where I sat in a room with a colleague who was Irish, and we were talking about something with the police department, and I used the term paddy wagon. And he very nicely educated me, not that he needed to be nice, but he was very respectful about it, that that was an Irish slur. And I was like, oh, for someone who like considers herself very woke and aware, and woke wasn't really the terminology at the time, right? But very aware and I was like mortified that like I didn't know this and that I had said this. But I also feel like there was like some piece of that, the way that my father handled, like, well, when you do something, like you own it and you apologize for it and you learn from it and you don't do it again. That allowed me in that moment to not crumble, to not hide, to not get defensive, but to say, I apologize. Of course it makes sense to me now that what you've just said, of course I see the connection. I didn't think of that at all. I just use the term. I appreciate you bringing that to my attention. You can rest assured I will not be using that term again, right? And I hope that we can create those kinds of opportunities, right? Small example, but opportunities where we can mess up. We can call each other in on what that mess up is, provide some other information, and that we in that moment can grow from it and take it in. You're right. It wasn't mine to say, that's not what I meant, or or that's not what it means, or right, even worse, to say that's not what it means, right? Which is what we sometimes do with other people's experience, is to like negate it and make it our own thing, right? I just owned it. I learned something in the moment, and so it's the kind of space I hope I created with my kids, is that none of us are perfect. We know what we know, and there's a whole lot out there that we don't know, that we've never been experienced to, and in that, like, the thing is to be curious and to notice and to be open in those moments. So I appreciate you being curious to do this with me, and open and willing to have the conversation. You've already mentioned a few things that you're doing to create sort of greater racial equity in your spheres of influence, which could be your professional or personal life. But anything else you want to just highlight?
So much of I don't have children. So much of my identity is bound up in my work. And so what comes to my mind is mostly work. I will say, as somebody who doesn't have children in my own family, it's been really interesting to see, just parenthetically, like older members of my family, aunts and uncles who are in their 60s and 70s, who are open to having conversations that I don't think they would have been 5 years ago. We have a family reunion every year over 4th of July, and we didn't hold it this year, but a year ago we had this incredibly robust conversation about white privilege and what it means to have an advantage because we are white, with 4 or 5 of my aunts and uncles, and it was really something. So I know that's just a sort of side note, but it's not a conversation that would have been had.
Yeah, I don't think that's a side note at all. Right? I think that's how it's going to happen.
Right. Like, we just have to keep talking about it. And then in the workspace, I think one of the things that's been up for me lately is the urgency of the moment and the long game that this work is, and finding that balance. I'm a white woman leader at an organization that is historically white-led and that serves a majority population of color. 56% of our patients are people of color. We have a lot of work to do inside the organization to ensure that we have those capacities that I was talking about earlier, that ability to create an environment where we are welcoming and affirming genuinely to everybody who walks in our doors, that we can work across difference with our patients and with each other in our teams, across the whole organization in every role, because that will just make us the most awesome Planned Parenthood we could possibly be. It means that we'll have the most impact in the community that we could possibly have. So a lot of our work, I think, even in this urgent moment, needs to continue to focus internally. And there are things that we need to be doing right now. And then there are things that we need to recognize that, people in the organization actually only have so much individual capacity to do work and learn at the same time and do their full-time jobs. And so how do we create, this this like horrible, messy tension that I'm trying to describe is always on my mind. Probably doesn't make any sense, but I'm trying. That like, how do we do the work, keep doing the work, have the support we need to do the work, but keep doing the actual additional, like the additional work of, I shouldn't say actual, but the day-to-day work, mission work of the organization, while continuing to support people in growing and creating space for that. And then also be showing up as a good partner in our communities. And understanding from the other organizations, the local organizations, what they need and what they want from Planned Parenthood. And you might remember this, Karen, but I remember in one of my first conversations with the board at PPSNE, one of the things that I expressed concern about then and still think about a lot today is the risk of Planned Parenthood being like the big pink elephant in the room and taking up all the space is real. And so as we do external facing work, we need to be sure that we don't do that, that we're really showing up as like a partner and an ally and an amplifier and a potentiator, and not as like trying to take over other people's work. And then internally, it's just like keep creating the space, keep finding ways to work around the systems that we operate in. Because that's, I don't know, we could have a whole nother conversation about that, about like, how do you do anti-racism work? Or how do you dismantle systems of oppression in the system that exists? And I don't know, it always reminds me of that, like, how do you eat an elephant one forkful at a time or something? Like, it can feel like you're trying to shovel the ocean with a fork, but you have to keep shoveling. You know, that's what we're doing. And I think a lot of my responsibility in particular is modeling what you talked about a moment ago in your conversation with your Irish colleague, which is that when I screw up, just owning it and taking the learning opportunity. There was a turn of phrase I used recently in a leadership team meeting that I will never use again. In my whole life, it hadn't occurred to me what it meant. And I'm a little afraid to use it because I don't want to trigger people who might be watching. But as soon as someone pointed out to me how it could land with people, I was like, oh my God, I will not. Yes, thank you. So I was like, thank you so much for saying that to me. You are right. That turn of phrase is out of my lexicon. Or even things about like ableism. That's a place where I have a lot of work to do in terms of phrase like blind spot. Deaf to that. Those are maybe ones that I have had to like learn, like how impactful those are for people who that is part of their identity and when it's not part of mine. So I don't know. I'm rambling a little bit, but
no, thank you for being in this and demonstrating what it is to learn as we're in the work, right? And that ability, I think, is going to make a huge difference, right? That ability to be open and notice and to own our stuff, right? I never believe I'm going to get to a point where I don't have biases. I believe I'm going to get to the place where I am very much aware of what my biases are, and in that give myself a broader range, right, of behaviors and thoughts and ideas about things, and not just default to whatever that message is that's internal. And so it does require examining the air we breathe, right, the things we've just taken for granted. So thank you so much for sharing the mic with me. And taking this opportunity to have a conversation about our shared humanity and how we're going to move forward in ways that really promote greater racial equity. I appreciate you, and I thank you so much.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking me. I'm enormously honored, really, and I'm so grateful for your friendship and partnership.
As am I. Thanks, and have a great night.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen.